The day the letter arrived, I thought it was a mistake. But by the time I finished reading it, my hands were shaking. Final notice: failure to comply may result in legal action. Those words were stamped in bold red across the page, like someone wanted fear to jump straight into my chest. I stood there in my kitchen, staring at the paper, wondering how things had gotten this far. I had lived in this neighborhood for years. Quiet life. Simple routines. No arguments, no complaints, no drama. Yet somehow, the HOA had decided I was their next target. Outside my window, the street looked peaceful: trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, neighbors walking their dogs. It was the kind of place people called perfect. But anyone who lived here long enough knew the truth. Behind the smiles and HOA newsletters was something darker: control. And now that control was knocking at my door. The letter claimed my backyard structure violated community rules. It ordered immediate removal, threatened fines, and warned that legal enforcement would follow if I didn't comply. I read it again, slower this time. Something about it felt wrong. I knew every inch of my property. I hadn't built anything illegal. Still, the tone of the letter wasn't a request, it was a warning. That afternoon, I saw her. The HOA president. The woman everyone quietly called Karen. She stood across the street with two board members, pretending to inspect the neighborhood. But every few seconds, her eyes drifted toward my house. Toward my backyard. I could almost feel the judgment from where I stood. I stepped outside, trying to stay calm. She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You received our notice?" she asked. I nodded. "Good," she said. "We expect full compliance. Otherwise, things can escalate quickly." Then she turned and walked away like the conversation was already finished. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about rules. This was personal. That night, I sat alone at my table, the letter beside me, replaying her words in my head. Fear slowly turned into something else: anger. Not loud anger. Quiet anger. The kind that makes you think carefully instead of reacting. I opened my laptop. If they wanted a fight, I was going to understand every rule better than they did. Because something told me the truth wasn't on their side. And if I was right, this wasn't going to end the way they expected. It was only the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. The letter sat on my table like a silent threat, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again: calm, confident, almost amused. "Things can escalate quickly." That line echoed in my mind like a warning meant to scare me into obedience. But fear has a strange way of turning into focus. By midnight, I had pulled out every document I could find: closing papers, HOA welcome packets, neighborhood guidelines, even old emails I barely remembered receiving. I spread everything across the table like puzzle pieces, determined to understand what they were really accusing me of. At first, the rules looked overwhelming. Pages of legal language, vague restrictions, and endless fine print. Most homeowners probably never read beyond the first page. That was probably the point. I read anyway. Line by line. The violation notice claimed my backyard structure was non-compliant with updated architectural standards. That sounded serious until I noticed something small. The rule they referenced had an amendment date from years after I bought my property. That caught my attention. I kept reading. Then I saw another detail: certain lots were marked as part of an older development phase, meaning they followed a different set of rules. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed my property documents and checked the map attached to my purchase agreement. My lot number was right there. Phase 1. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the papers. If I understood this correctly, the rule they were threatening me with didn't apply to me at all. But I didn't want to assume. HOAs rarely backed down without a fight, and accusing them without proof would only make things worse. So the next morning, I drove to the county records office. The building smelled like old paper and coffee. I waited quietly while the clerk pulled archived files. When she returned, she placed a thick folder in front of me. "Everything related to your property," she said. I spent hours going through it. Maps, legal filings, development agreements. And then I found it. A county-approved exemption tied to my land, signed, stamped, and recorded years ago. It clearly stated that lots in my section were not subject to certain HOA restrictions unless owners voluntarily opted in. I never had. My hands stopped shaking. For the first time since the letter arrived, I smiled. They weren't just wrong, they were completely wrong. Driving home, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was gone. In its place was quiet confidence. They had threatened me, hoping I would panic, pay fines, or tear down something I legally owned. But now I had proof. Real proof. And suddenly, I understood why Karen had sounded so certain. She assumed I wouldn't check. She assumed I would fold. She had no idea what was coming next. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. By the time I parked outside the community center, the sun was going down, throwing long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. People were already gathering near the entrance, holding folders and coffee cups, chatting like it was just another routine meeting. But the moment I walked in, conversation softened. A few people glanced at me, then looked away. Word traveled fast in neighborhoods like this. I wasn't nervous anymore, but I was focused. Inside my bag sat copies of county records, stamped documents, and property maps. Evidence. Not opinions. Not arguments. Just facts. I took a seat near the back. At the front of the room, Karen arranged papers with confident energy. She wore a bright smile, the kind that looked pleasant from a distance but felt cold up close. Two other board members sat beside her, flipping through agendas. The meeting started with small things: landscaping updates, parking reminders, committee announcements. I waited quietly, listening while my name hovered just ahead on the agenda. Then it happened. Karen cleared her throat. "Next item," she said, scanning the room. "Enforcement action regarding non-compliant property structure." Every head turned toward me. She continued, voice steady and practiced. "Despite multiple notices, the homeowner has refused to remove a structure that violates community standards. The board is prepared to move forward with legal enforcement." A few people murmured. Someone whispered behind me. I stood slowly. "I'd like to respond," I said. She gave a polite nod, but I could see confidence in her eyes, like she expected excuses or emotional arguments. Instead, I walked forward and placed my folder on the table. "I reviewed the rule you cited," I said calmly. "And I also reviewed county records." Her smile faded just slightly. I handed copies to each board member. They looked confused as they began reading. "This document," I continued, tapping the first page, "shows my property is part of Phase 1 development. According to county filings, those lots are exempt from the architectural rule you're trying to enforce." Silence. One board member frowned, flipping pages faster. Karen crossed her arms. "That can't be correct," she said quickly. "It is," I replied. "It's recorded with the county. Signed and filed years ago." The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy, like everyone was holding the same breath. The board members leaned together, whispering. One of them looked up at Karen with an expression I couldn't quite read: surprise mixed with concern. She tried to regain control. "We'll need to verify these documents." I nodded. "Of course. But until then, any enforcement action against my property would be legally questionable." That line hit harder than I expected. Neighbors shifted in their seats. Some looked impressed. Others looked nervous. For the first time, Karen didn't seem in charge. I gathered my papers and stepped back. The meeting moved on, but the energy in the room had changed completely. They had expected compliance. Instead, they had just met resistance, the legal kind. And this was only the first round. The morning after the meeting felt strangely quiet. No warning letters. No angry emails. No sudden visits from the HOA board. For a moment, I almost thought it was over. Maybe they had reviewed the documents overnight and realized they couldn't push any further. But peace didn't last long. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Subject: Urgent follow-up HOA compliance review. I opened it slowly. The message was polite on the surface, but the tone underneath was clear. The board claimed they were still reviewing legal interpretations and requested a private meeting to discuss possible resolutions. They also suggested that continuing to resist could lead to unnecessary complications. I read that last line twice. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it felt like one. Instead of replying immediately, I walked outside to clear my head. The neighborhood looked normal, but I noticed something new. Curtains moving. Neighbors watching. A few people who usually waved now seemed cautious, like they didn't want to get involved. HOA drama spread fast. Later that afternoon, I saw Karen again. She was standing near the mailbox cluster, talking to another neighbor. When she noticed me, her smile appeared instantly, too friendly, too rehearsed. "Hope we can settle this calmly," she said as I passed. I stopped. "I prefer following the law," I replied. Her smile tightened. That evening, I received another message, this time from a neighbor I barely knew. He wrote quietly, almost secretly. "Be careful. They don't like being challenged." The word stuck with me. I started noticing small things after that. An inspection notice placed on my door. A reminder about lawn measurements. A warning about trash bin placement, something no one else on the street seemed to get. It felt coordinated. They couldn't enforce the big rule anymore, so they were trying to pressure me through smaller ones. Instead of reacting emotionally, I documented everything. Photos. Emails. Dates. Times. Every interaction went into a folder on my computer. If this turned into a legal fight, I wanted a clear record. A week passed. Then another meeting notice arrived, this time marked mandatory attendance. I knew what it meant. They were going to try again, maybe publicly this time, hoping pressure from the community would make me back down. But something inside me had changed since that first letter. I wasn't scared anymore. Every step they took only confirmed what I already suspected: they weren't used to someone pushing back. That night, I called an attorney. I didn't plan to start a lawsuit. I just wanted clarity. When I explained the situation and emailed the documents, the lawyer paused for a moment before saying something that surprised me. "You're in a very strong position," he said. "If they keep targeting you after receiving proof, that could be considered harassment." I leaned back, stunned. For the first time, I realized this fight wasn't just about protecting my property. They might have crossed a legal line. And if they had, the next meeting wasn't going to go the way they expected. The second HOA meeting felt different before it even started. The parking lot was fuller than usual, and people were standing in small groups, whispering like they were waiting for entertainment. I could feel the tension in the air the moment I stepped out of my car. Some neighbors nodded politely, but others avoided eye contact, as if simply talking to me might pull them into the conflict. I carried a thin folder under my arm, updated documents, notes from my attorney, and copies of every notice the HOA had sent since the first meeting. Inside the hall, Karen was already seated at the front, flipping through papers with sharp, controlled movements. She looked confident again, like she had spent the last week rebuilding her strategy. The meeting began quickly. Routine announcements came and went, but this time I noticed something strange. Several agenda items seemed aimed directly at my property, vague references to maintaining community standards and addressing recurring compliance concerns. Then my name appeared on the screen behind the board. Karen stood up. "We've reviewed the homeowner's claims," she said smoothly, "but we still believe the structure creates a concern for community appearance and precedent." Precedent. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. She continued, "The board proposes a compromise. Remove the structure voluntarily, and we'll close the matter without further escalation." Murmurs rippled through the room. I stood slowly. "There's nothing to compromise," I said calmly. "The county documents prove your rule doesn't apply to my property." She smiled tightly. "That interpretation is still being debated." I opened my folder and held up a new document. "It's not being debated," I said. "My attorney reviewed everything. Continued enforcement attempts after receiving proof could be legally considered targeted harassment." The room fell silent. One board member shifted uncomfortably. Another stopped taking notes altogether. Karen's expression hardened. "Are you threatening the board?" I shook my head. "No. I'm protecting my rights." For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, like the entire room had leaned forward waiting for someone to blink first. Then a voice came from the audience. "Actually, he's right." Everyone turned. It was one of the older neighbors, someone who had lived there longer than almost anyone else. He stood slowly, holding an old binder. "When this neighborhood was built," he said, "Phase 1 had different agreements. I remember signing them." More whispers. Another neighbor nodded. "I think my lot has that exemption too." Suddenly, the room wasn't on the board's side anymore. Karen looked around, realizing control was slipping. She tried to move on to the next agenda item, but the energy had changed completely. People were asking questions now, real ones. About rules. About authority. About fairness. The meeting ended early again. As I walked out, I overheard someone whisper, "Maybe the HOA went too far." Outside, the cool night air felt different, lighter somehow. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Because when power starts slipping away from people who are used to having it, they don't give up quietly. After the second meeting, something shifted in the neighborhood. People who used to stay silent began asking questions. A few neighbors stopped me while walking their dogs, quietly admitting they had received confusing notices too. One woman said she paid a fine years ago because she didn't know she could challenge it. Another neighbor confessed he was afraid to speak up because the board made life difficult for anyone who disagreed. The more I listened, the more a pattern started to appear. This wasn't just about my barn. That realization stayed with me as I sat at my kitchen table that night, reviewing everything again. The stack of documents had grown bigger: violation letters, emails, meeting minutes, and notes from conversations. At first, I thought I was defending myself. Now it felt like I was uncovering something bigger. The next morning, I received an unexpected email. It was from one of the HOA board members, not Karen, but another member who had mostly stayed quiet during meetings. "Can we speak privately?" I hesitated before replying, but curiosity won. We met at a small coffee shop outside the neighborhood. He looked nervous, constantly glancing toward the door before speaking. "I didn't agree with how this was handled," he said quietly. "But once things started, it was hard to stop." He explained that the board had pushed aggressive enforcement to show strength after recent complaints about neighborhood standards. Karen believed strict action would set an example. "But your property should have never been targeted," he admitted. "Some of us told her that." I listened carefully. Then he said something that made me sit up straighter. "There were discussions about pushing you until you complied, even if the rule wasn't clear." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you have proof?" I asked. He paused, then nodded slowly. A few days later, he sent me copies of internal meeting notes. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just summaries and comments. But between the lines, the intention was obvious. Phrases like make example, pressure compliance, and avoid legal debate in public. I forwarded everything to my attorney. His reply came quickly. This changes things. He explained that if the board knowingly continued enforcement after recognizing the exemption, it could strengthen a harassment case significantly. I wasn't looking for revenge, but suddenly I understood the power of documentation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Some people believed the board had made a mistake. Others thought I was trying to weaken the HOA entirely. Karen, however, disappeared from view. No emails. No visits. Just silence. That worried me more than confrontation. Because silence usually meant planning. Late one evening, while organizing files, my phone buzzed with a new notification. It was an official HOA email announcing an emergency board meeting closed session, no homeowner attendance. I stared at the screen, feeling something settle in my chest. They were regrouping. And whatever they decided next, would either end this conflict for good or push it into an entirely new fight. The emergency HOA meeting came and went without homeowners present. No updates. No explanations. Just silence stretching over the neighborhood like a storm waiting to break. Even the usual email reminders about trash bins and lawn care stopped for a few days. It felt unnatural, like everyone was holding their breath. I knew better than to assume that meant peace. 3 days later, my attorney called. They're deciding how to move forward, he said calmly. So now we do something they won't expect. That afternoon, he drafted a formal legal response, not a lawsuit, not a threat filled with emotion, but a precise document written in clear, controlled language. Every paragraph referenced facts, county exemptions, meeting records, enforcement attempts after proof was provided, and internal notes showing intent to pressure compliance. The final sentence was simple. Any further targeted action could result in legal consequences for misuse of HOA authority. When I read it, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole thing started: confidence. We sent it certified mail to the HOA board. Then we waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Each day felt longer than the last. I still walked the neighborhood, still mowed my lawn, still greeted neighbors politely. But inside, I wondered how they would react. Anger? Retaliation? Or silence again? On the 4th day, I noticed something unusual. Karen's car was parked outside the community office early in the morning. Another board member arrived soon after, followed by 2 more. Through the glass door, I could see papers spread across the table. They were reading something carefully. Hours later, an email landed in my inbox. Subject: Board Communication. I opened it slowly. The message was short and formal. The HOA acknowledged receipt of legal documentation. They stated the board would reassess all enforcement actions related to my property and would temporarily suspend penalties until further review. I read it twice, almost laughing in disbelief. A week earlier they had acted unstoppable. Now they were cautious. That evening, I walked outside and noticed neighbors watching quietly. One older man gave me a thumbs up. Another whispered, "About time someone pushed back." The story had spread. But the real shock came 2 days later. A second email arrived, this one addressed to the entire neighborhood. The board announced a policy review to ensure fairness and legal compliance moving forward. They also mentioned revisiting past enforcement cases. That wasn't damage control. That was retreat. For the first time since the conflict started, I realized something powerful: my legal response hadn't just protected me, it had forced them to look at everything they had been doing. Yet despite the victory, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. Karen hadn't said a word publicly. No apology. No defense. Just silence. And sometimes, silence means someone is preparing one final move. The neighborhood felt different after the board's announcement. People talked more openly now. Neighbors who once avoided HOA conversations were suddenly sharing stories, fines they paid without understanding why, warnings they received for small things, letters that felt more like threats than guidance. It was like someone had finally flipped on a light, and everyone could see what had been happening all along. But despite the quiet support, I stayed careful. Victories can make people careless. And I knew Karen well enough to believe she wouldn't disappear without trying to regain control. The final HOA meeting of the month was announced a few days later. Unlike the previous ones, this meeting promised important updates regarding policy changes. The room filled quickly. People arrived early, whispering and watching the front table with curiosity. Karen was there. But something about her looked different, less confident, more tense. She avoided eye contact as board members organized stacks of papers. The meeting began. One board member, not Karen, stood to speak first. After reviewing legal documentation and county records, he said carefully, "The board has determined that certain enforcement actions were issued incorrectly." The room went quiet. He continued, "Specifically, some properties, including those in Phase 1, are exempt from the rule previously cited." A ripple moved through the crowd. I stayed still, listening. Then came the moment no one expected. "We are withdrawing enforcement actions against the homeowner involved," he added, glancing briefly in my direction. People started whispering louder now. Karen shifted in her seat but said nothing. Another board member stood next. "We are also reviewing internal processes to prevent this from happening again." That sentence carried weight. It wasn't just an apology, it was an admission. For a moment, I felt everything slow down. Weeks of stress, late-night research, and endless tension suddenly collapsed into quiet clarity. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't fought emotionally. I had simply stayed calm and followed the law. Then Karen finally spoke. Her voice was controlled, but softer than before. "We acted based on information we believed to be correct," she said. "Moving forward, the board will focus on better communication." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she was willing to give. The meeting ended with polite applause, but the real reaction happened afterward. Neighbors approached me quietly. Some thanked me. Others admitted they were inspired to review their own property documents. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in months. But the biggest surprise came as I walked toward my car. One of the board members caught up to me. "Off the record," he said quietly, "your legal letter changed everything." The board realized this could have gone very badly. I nodded, unsure what to say. Driving home, I realized something important. The fight hadn't ended because someone won an argument. It ended because facts left no room for noise. And as I pulled into my driveway, looking at the structure they tried so hard to remove, I finally felt peace settle in. But one final chapter remained, the moment everyone would truly understand what happened. The morning after the final meeting, I woke up expecting more emails, more notices, maybe even another twist. Instead, there was nothing. No warning letters. No passive-aggressive reminders. Just quiet. For the first time in months, my house felt like mine again. Sunlight spilled into the kitchen as I made coffee, and I caught myself smiling at something simple: the absence of tension. The folder of documents still sat on the table, thick with evidence and notes. Weeks earlier it felt like a shield. Now it felt like a reminder of what calm persistence could do. Outside, the neighborhood moved normally. Kids rode bikes. Someone watered their lawn. A few neighbors waved as they passed, and this time their smiles felt genuine, not cautious, not curious. Later that afternoon, a new email arrived from the HOA. I opened it carefully. It was short and formal. All enforcement actions regarding your property have been permanently closed. That was it. No explanation. No argument. No defense. Just finality. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment sink in. They had started this believing I would give in quietly. They assumed a threatening letter would be enough. But when the facts came out, when the legal documents spoke louder than opinions, everything changed. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Karen walked past my house while I was working outside. For a moment, I thought she would ignore me like always. Instead, she slowed down. "We're updating procedures," she said quietly, almost carefully. "Things got complicated." I nodded. "It happens." She hesitated, like she wanted to say more, then simply added, "Take care," and kept walking. That was the closest thing to peace we were going to have. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood changed in small ways. HOA meetings became calmer. Rules were explained more clearly. People asked questions without fear of being singled out. Even neighbors who barely spoke before seemed more confident. I realized something surprising: this had never really been about revenge. It was about balance. When one side believes no one will challenge them, power becomes careless. But when someone stands up calmly, armed with facts instead of anger, the entire system adjusts. One evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange. The backyard structure stood exactly where it always had, untouched, legal, and peaceful. The same thing that almost started a legal war now felt ordinary again.
My phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor. "Thanks for turning up." A lot of us learned something. I started at the screen, feeling a quick sense of color. The HOA never admitted defied publicity. They didn't need to. Their silence side everything, and that how it ended, not with shouting, not with drama, but with a simple truth. Everyone finally understood. Sometimes the strongest response isn't loud, it's legal.